Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
It's a delight to be speaking at an organization which was founded in a coffee house and dedicated to changing society for the better. I hope to contribute in one small way. Let me start by telling you about a classical experiment in social psychology. It was done at a divinity school at Princeton University, and it was done with divinity students. They were told they're going to give a practice sermon, and they'd be evaluated on the sermon that they gave. Each of them was given a topic from the Bible. Half of them received as their topic the parable of the Good Samaritan, the man who stopped to help the stranger in need by the side of the road. The other half were given random Bible topics. Then, one by one, they went over to another building to give the practice sermon and be evaluated. As each of them went over to the other building, they passed a man who was bent over and moaning in pain. The question is, did they stop to help the stranger in need by the side of the road? More interesting, did it matter whether they were mulling the parable of the Good Samaritan? What do you think? It didn't make any difference. What mattered was how much time pressure they felt they were under. And that, sad to say, is rather the story of our lives, at least my life. I don't know about yours, but we have so much coming in, so much information glut these days, and pings and pop-ups on our computers and things to do, that we miss the moment more often than not. And there is a spectrum that runs from noticing the person, attuning to the person, empathizing, understanding their situation, and if they're in need or in pain, if there's something we might do to help them, having compassion for them, and then acting. And if we don't notice in the first place, we won't go down that road. I've been a little disturbed by some data that I write about in Focus that comes out of a group at the University of California at Berkeley that's been looking at the relationship between power and attention. And basically the finding is that people of higher social status, higher power, pay less attention to people of lower power. It's quite the opposite going up the power line, because if you have little power, if you have little that you can depend on, you actually pay much more attention to the people around you because they're resources. If you're a working mom, who's going to watch your kids till you get home from work? When they come from school, it's the neighbor that you have a good relationship with. So people of less power in society pay lots of attention to people of more power and also the people around them. They have more empathy. They have stronger connections. Wealthy people can hire someone to look after their children. So these Keltners, Datcher Keltner, the psychologist who does research, assumes that this is one of the major factors in the phenomena. The question is, what can we do to overcome this empathy gap, if you grant that there may be an empathy gap? I met a fellow from the UK when I was a graduate student. He was also a graduate student. He was from the Guinness family. He was very wealthy. And his goal, I don't know if he ever fulfilled this, was very interesting in light of this. He wanted to go back to the UK, get a job on an auto assembly line. He hoped to become elected union steward, and then to go from there to standing for Parliament on the Labour ticket. I have no idea if he did that. But what he proposed actually is the recipe, or one recipe, for overcoming this gap. When there are two groups, rich, poor, Israeli, Palestinian, Catholic, Protestant, whatever it may be, that have a divide, Across that divide, if there are biases, there tends to be something called the narcissism of minor differences. This was Freud's phrase, where, for instance, I was speaking some years ago to a Turkish psychiatrist named Vamik Volkan. Vamik grew up in Cyprus, and he grew up at a time when there was animosity between the Cypriots and the Turks, and his family was Turkish. And he said, when I grew up, the Cypriots were demonized in my household. Then I got to know some, and it was nonsense. They're really no different than us. And in fact, the most powerful way to overcome divides is contact, personal contact. There's a study that was done by a psychologist at University of California at Santa Cruz now, Thomas Pettigrew. He looked at over 500 separate studies that were assessing when you have two groups that have a divide, what is it that heals that divide? And the most powerful thing is just plain personal contact. People who have friends on the other group don't hold those prejudices, don't have those biases. The question is, what could we do that would help children grow up without bias, without stereotype? And you can't have contact with every group, but there are programs that increase empathy in kids. And I think that this is a very positive development. In the States, it's called social emotional learning. And I made an argument for just this kind of education when I wrote Emotional Intelligence. There are now hundreds of programs in tens of thousands of schools that teach self-awareness. They teach managing your emotions effectively, and they teach empathy, and they teach cooperation, social skills. That's the emotional intelligence spectrum. But it's the empathy part of that I think is extremely important, that children grow up understanding, when I did that, it made her feel this way. That's a basic lesson in empathy for a young child. And it gets more and more sophisticated as they grow. But what they find is that if you teach empathy to kids in this way, that schools have less bullying. Kids are more tolerant. There's less bias, less stereotyping. They're better at teamwork and collaboration. When I was at the New York Times some years ago, I had an assignment to write about people who were homeless. This was in the 80s. And all of a sudden, there was a huge explosion. I don't know about London. I see lots of people sleeping on the streets here. I don't know when it began to be so commonplace, but in New York, it was the 80s. My training was in clinical psychology before I became a journalist, and I realized as I went around with some social workers whose job was to get to know the people who lived on the street, try to get them to come to a homeless shelter, at least bring them some food. They knew every person by name who was living on the streets there. And I realized that most of them would fit into a psychiatric diagnosis. And what had happened was that the mental hospitals were closed in the state to save money, and the community programs that were supposed to have replaced them were never funded. So people who otherwise would have been in a psychiatric situation were now homeless and on the street. I did that article. I was rather sensitized, and I started noticing people that we walk by. But it's so easy not to notice, and not to notice people in need. And it means we don't go down the compassion route. So I was on my way home from the paper. It was a Friday afternoon. It was rush hour, and I was going down in Times Square, a very busy part of New York, into the subway. And on the steps, there was a man huddled over, shirtless, not moving. And people were just stepping over this guy and going on to their train. But I was kind of sensitized to the situation, so I stopped. The minute I stopped, a ring of people stopped around this fellow. We found out he didn't speak English. He was Hispanic. He'd been wandering around with no money for several days, and he had fainted from hunger. Immediately, someone went to get him a hot dog. Someone went to get him some orange juice. Someone brought someone from the subway authority, and all of a sudden, he was being taken care of. But what it took was that moment of noticing.
I'm very grateful to you for Dan, for taking one particular part of a very rich book. And what I want to do in the questions is to pull you back to the kind of broader thesis of the book, if that's okay. And my sense is, if you were to try to sum up quite a big part of the book, it is that there are two good states to be in a sense, in relation to focus. One is to be focused, and the other is, in a sense, to be in a kind of mindful state, as it were, not focusing on anything, letting one's mind wander. These are the two states, to be focused or to let one's mind do what one might. But actually, most of us spend most of our time now in this perpetual state of semi-focus, moving from one thing to another, never being entirely focused and never either relaxing our mind and letting our mind wander. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, I'm trying, in the book, I try to establish the value of each kind of attention. So one is focused attention, which is highly valued. If you want to learn something, if you want to get your work done, you need to be concentrated. Another is an open awareness. You know, if you're out in nature, just enjoying yourself, you want to open the senses. A third is mind wandering. Mind wandering is actually undervalued in school and at work, but mind wandering is essential for creativity, for accessing two novel elements that you combine in a way which has a use. There was a group of researchers that gave 2,500 people an iPhone app which rang them at random points in the day and asked two questions. What are you doing and what are you thinking about? Right? 50% of the time, people are thinking about something other than what they're doing. That's called mind wandering. Now, it varies. The single activity, this is perhaps no surprise, that had the highest, my mind is right here, was making love. However, who answers an iPhone app? The most mind wandering was commuting, sitting at a computer, and being at work. I'm sorry, managers, employers take note, but it is true that most of our minds are elsewhere during work time. But mind wandering has value too. It's just when it's out of place or it's at the wrong time that it's not so good. And then I talk about self-awareness, I talk about empathy and compassion as other varieties of focus that have their uses.
The Good Samaritan story, and it's one of my favourite social psychology experiments as well. One set of psychological insights would suggest to you that this is a classic example of priming. They'd have heard the Good Samaritan story, that would have primed them, and then they would have gone on to show compassion.
Right.
So this priming effect is massively cancelled out by the fact of them being kind of distracted. So that implies that to release our good instincts, an empty mind which releases our kind of deeper empathy is more powerful than wandering around in a state of concentrated piety.
Well, there's another way to look at it, which is the difference between espoused compassion and enacted. And as you say, if we're well primed, if we're well prepared to enact, then we're more likely to do something in the moment when it presents itself. But if our minds are elsewhere, what am I going to say in this practice sermon? How are they going to evaluate me? Worry like that. Then our focus, our scope of focus collapses into the self-absorption. And so often through the day, we go through whatever situation we're in, focused inwardly, rather than in this open awareness you're talking about.
Now, there's been a lively debate, a continuing lively debate, and in fact it's, I'm certain, going to get more and more lively, between those who are worried about the impact on young people of being surrounded by technology and those who are relaxed about it, or say that certainly there's no evidence to worry about. Now, it seems to me that in that debate you're really on the former side rather than the latter. You think the evidence is growing that the ubiquity of electronic communication devices surrounding young people is having a harmful effect on their capacity to concentrate?
Well, that's an educated guess, really. But what I think is happening is this. All of us, particularly those of us who have lots of technological gadgets, are finding our attention pulled away from where we might choose it to be in very seductive ways. Not in a mean way, but it's just so much more interesting to check your email or see if you've gotten a text, or maybe to wander the web. What it means is that willed attention becomes more and more scarce. It's a rarer commodity. And attention is a mental muscle. We need to exercise it, and the more we exercise it, the stronger it becomes. And what I'm worried about is that kids are growing up in an environment where they're going to become flabby attentionally. I don't know about here in the UK, but in the States, you'll see a 3-year-old staring at a screen because it's easier to manage a 3-year-old staring at a screen. So parents give kids devices. And to let your attention be passively controlled by that device rather than actively putting it where you want does something very different to the attentional circuit. So that's why I become an advocate, actually, of teaching attentional skills, of exercising this in school as part of the curriculum. For one thing, it makes kids more ready to learn.
We obviously think a lot here at the RSA about innovation. And there's a kind of notion that one of the reasons people need to work very intensively and, in a way, possibly be surrounded by all this information is in order to innovate. But one of the points you make in the book is that very often inventors say that their great innovations came to them at moments when they weren't focusing, they weren't concentrating.
That's right. Yes, and there's a good reason for that.
Why is that? How does that happen?
It happens because, for example, if you're trying to solve a problem in math, something really intense and abstract, you have to immerse yourself in it. You have to absorb all the relevant information. But most of the brain actually is in what's called the cognitive unconscious. There's a vast secret circuitry that we don't have direct access to, but it keeps everything we know in line, and it also is able to do work to process mentally without our knowing it. And it's when your mind is wandering, when you're walking the dog, when you're getting on the bus, when you're taking the shower, you're not doing anything in particular, that it is able to present its answer to us. So that's why the annals of science and mathematics actually are rife with examples of this, of some brilliant solution coming up, when someone is doing nothing in particular. But it's because their base brain has been working on it very hard.
Now, I don't know how you came up with the idea of emotional intelligence, whether this too occurred to you at a time when you weren't focusing on your studies. But I'm very interested in what happens when you develop an idea with as much power as emotional intelligence, because there's two things that interest me. The first is, are you pleased or disappointed with the degree to which it's actually affected what goes on, particularly in education? Because actually, probably since you brought these ideas to prominence, the intensification of kind of the narrow academic standards approach to schooling has probably increased, certainly has in this country. We've become less emotionally intelligent probably in the way in which we educate children. I think that's happened in the States as well. So the first part of the question is, what's your account of how it is this idea has or has not influenced policymakers? And the other idea is, what's your experience of how people use this idea? When you've had an idea as big as this, which a lot of people who probably haven't read the original book can apply in all sorts of ways, do you kind of get a bit tired of people misusing the idea or applying it in a very kind of woolly way?
A few things. First, I have to disabuse you of the notion that I invented emotional intelligence. Okay. I didn't. It was developed by a friend of mine, Peter Salovey, who's now the president of Yale University, and a graduate student of his at the time, Peter Salovey. But they published it in a very obscure journal. They had an article called Emotional Intelligence. The journal is so obscure it does not exist today. However, I saved that idea. What I did was recognize its value. Since then, it's become startlingly powerful in two sectors particularly. One, as you say, is education. The other is business. It's become kind of standard for assessing leadership abilities. So there are many industries in the business sector. There is a whole legion now of executive coaches, for example. And there is a vast movement in education, despite the tightening, maybe because of the tightening of the more academic rigor. I was visiting a classroom in Spanish Harlem, a very impoverished section of New York. And there every day, these 7-year-olds have a session in what they call breathing buddies. They go to their cubby and they get a little stuffed animal. They find a place to lie down on a carpet. They put the animal on their belly and they watch it rise and fall as they breathe in and out. They count 1, 2, 3 on the in-breath, 1, 2, 3 on the out-breath. And what they're doing is training that attention muscle. And it develops what's called cognitive control. And what this does is give a child a capacity that's learnable and improvable, that can add a capability to whatever their natural talents are.